Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat opened on Broadway in 1982. People seemed to love the show, but for some reason it didn't run very long. It closed the following year after 747 performances. Right after Joseph closed, the Broadway cast went on tour. And it was a big commitment because the show was going to tour for a year. And it's a wonderful show for men. So almost all of the men who were in the Broadway cast decided to do the tour. It's not a great show for women. There's not a lot of roles. And so the several women who were in the show decided not to do the tour. And fortunately, my wife, Sherry, was cast to fill one of those spots. So she toured with the Broadway cast for a year. Sherry and I were courting at the time, so I visited her several times, once in Toronto, in Baltimore, and in Boston. I was also good friends with the musical conductor, Carl German, and so it was fun to go see Sherry and Carl while they were touring. Carl, by the way, has been the musical conductor for The Lion King on Broadway for many years now, so if you get a chance, go see that show. It's a great show. The actor who played Joseph on the tour was a man named Don Goodspeed, very talented young actor and singer. But there were several large cities on the tour that would only take the show if David Cassidy played the role of Joseph. They wanted a name, a star to sell tickets. And many of you will remember David, the teenage heartthrob that was on the Partridge Family back in the 1970s. Well, in one of these big cities, David decided to have a cast party. He was generous enough to throw a cast party for everybody. And Sherry said she had a wonderful time, but the very next morning she woke up very, very sick. And she called the stage manager and said that she was sick and she needed her understudy to go on for her that night. And the stage manager said no. She informed Sherry that she had to go on. She had to do the show because the understudy was already going on for someone who was sick. In fact, everyone was sick. The entire cast, food poisoning from something they ate at the party. Question, how does a show go on when the entire cast has food poisoning? Answer, lots and lots of buckets. Sherry said there were buckets on both sides of the stage, backstage, so people would sing their part of the song, then run over to the side of the stage and get sick, and then run back on stage. Ain't show business wonderful? The story of Joseph in the book of Genesis has about every bad thing in it that you can imagine. Assault and battery, attempted murder, slavery, lying and deceit, adultery, prison confinement, executions. And so Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice come along and say, why don't we make a children's musical out of this? Yes, the authors of Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita wrote Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. In fact, they wrote it a long time before Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar. It was one of the first things they did. It was only 20 minutes long, its first production at a school. But after the huge success of Jesus Christ Superstar, people wanted to hear more material from these young musical geniuses. And so Joseph started to be reworked and expanded, and there were productions of it all through the 1970s, and then it finally landed on Broadway in 1982. Listen to this. By the year 2008, more than 20,000 schools and community theaters had staged a production of the show. Our theater produced it twice. The first time in 1994, and it was a huge hit. It's easy for me to remember the date we did the show because Sherry played the narrator, and she was pregnant with our twins at the time, they were born in February of 1995, and so during the show, Sherry was dressed in black to try to diminish the lump. Now, there, of course, are many, many, many inaccuracies in the musical. I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that Elvis really wasn't Pharaoh, that the brothers didn't really have French accents, and the colored coat that we learned about as children may not have been that colorful after all. Some scholars believe the more accurate translation of the text describes it as a long robe with sleeves. But as fluffy as this musical is, it still communicates some of the core messages of the biblical text. When you get to the end of the show, when Joseph is now second in command in Egypt, and his brothers come to him for help, not realizing who he is, you still get a lump in your throat when Joseph finally reveals to his brothers who he is and that he forgives them. Why is that? Why in this crazy, fluffy, giddy musical are we so moved at this moment in the show? I think it's because we all have relationships and situations in our lives that we wish were reconciled, that we wish were restored. Relationships that are broken, we wished were healed and whole again. With a parent, a son or daughter, a cousin, a church member, a former boss, or with God. We yearn for things to be better, to be healed, to be reconciled. We've started a new program here at the church for our young children called Godly Play. It uses the Montessori approach for helping children experience the stories and teachings of the Bible. One of the things I like about the program is that it calls the 10 Commandments the 10 best ways. When I was young, I questioned the commandment about coveting. You shall not covet. The actual text says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house or spouse. You shall not covet their servant or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, as a kid, I was surprised that that one made the top 10. I could see it in the top 30, maybe the top 20, but the top 10, it's not in the same league as thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. Besides, it's not even an action like killing or stealing. It's just a thought, a frame of mind. Coveting is a state of mind. But you know, now I get it. As I've gotten older, now I understand why this made the top 10 list. I've learned that nothing destroys relationships like jealousy, envy, greed, feelings of entitlement, which are all cousins of coveting. And what's especially troubling is that these feelings and thoughts can destroy the closest of relationships. Relationships with siblings, with spouses, with parent and child. It's what started this whole mess with Joseph. Mama and Daddy always loved you more. That's why you got more in the wills. Wills. That's when jealousy, envy, entitlement really make themselves known. After a parent's death and the reading of a will, siblings sometimes become bitter enemies, like Joseph and his brothers. And by the way, you know, the same thing happened between Joseph's father, Jacob, and his brother Esau. Remember that story? Jacob hid from his brother for many years because he was afraid that Esau would kill him for stealing Esau's birthright. Lots of jealousy and entitlement and envy and greed. That's the father. Jacob is the father. Esau, the uncle of these brothers. It's no wonder that Joseph and his brothers didn't have a good relationship. These poor family dynamics continued to cycle with the children. I know siblings who have not spoken to each other for years. I know parents and children who won't admit the others exist. I know parishioners who leave churches because they did not get what they felt was rightfully theirs. Someone was loved more than them or treated better than them. Thus, there are irreconcilable differences and broken relationships. And so what do we do? How are we supposed to respond as followers of Jesus Christ? How do we deal with our feelings of jealousy, envy, and entitlement? They're very real, aren't they? Well, the first thing we need to do is admit that we have those feelings, that those are part of our lives. It's impossible to do something about something if we don't recognize its existence, if we are in denial. We might as well admit we have those feelings because we're not fooling anyone. Everyone has them. It's universal. It's part of our humanity, part of our DNA. It's woven into our survival instinct. Another thing we need to do is to ask why. Why do we have these feelings? What do you think are the core reasons you feel the way you do? Not on the surface level, not even on a secondary level. I'm talking about real deep, down in the gut. What's it all about, Alfie, right? Where does our ego fit in with what we're dealing with? What do my fears and insecurities have to do with how I'm responding? As I've mentioned before in sermons, many people find it very helpful to use a therapist in this process, a professional psychiatrist or psychologist, someone who is trained in helping people work through these thoughts and feelings and questions. Another important thing we need to do is to put the situation in perspective. Ask yourself the question, are my feelings of jealousy and envy and entitlement worth destroying a relationship? Many of you have heard Dr. Phil McGraw ask his clients the well-known question, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? My perspective is that no material thing is worth ruining the relationship we have with another human being, especially if it is someone we are close with. We need to remember that our loved ones are rare treasures who are not permanent. Do we really want something to get in the way of our relationship with them? And then we move into the area that I think is the most important and most helpful in dealing with these feelings, and that's our spiritual life. I would encourage you to reflect on those wonderful words by the French theologian Teilhard de Chardin. And if you come here frequently, you know the words. We are not human beings searching for a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. The more we reflect and pray on that statement, the better we'll be at letting go of things. We'll be better at getting plugged into what is really, really important, the spiritual. And the more we can plug into that part of ourselves, the more we can let go of ego and the physical world, the more we'll be able to let go and trust and experience that fulfillment, that freedom that we talked about in the very first God on Broadway musical we used, Pippin. Then finally, we need to remind ourselves that we are children of God. Remind ourselves of our worth and our value so that our self-worth is not wrapped up in getting something or being recognized for doing something. Our self-worth comes from simply being a child of God, being loved by the great creator of the universe. Marcus Borg used to tell this wonderful story about a 3-year-old girl who was the only child in her family. But now her mom is pregnant, and this 3-year-old girl is very excited about having a baby in the house. The day comes where the mother-to-be delivers, and the mom and dad go off to the hospital. A couple of days later, they come home with a new baby brother. And the little girl is just delighted. But after they've been home for a couple of hours, the little girl tells her parents that she wants to be with the baby in the baby's room alone, with the door shut. She's absolutely insistent about the door being shut. It kind of gives her folks the willies, you know. I mean, they know she's a good little girl, but they've heard all about sibling rivalry and everything. And then they remember that they've recently installed an intercom system in preparation for the arrival of the baby. And they realize that they can let their little girl go do this. And if they hear the slightest weird thing happening, they can be in there in a flash. And so they let the little girl go into the room. They close the door behind her. And then they race to their listening post. And they hear her footsteps move across the room. They imagine her now standing over the baby's crib, of learning. She's standing over the baby's crib, and then they hear her say to her 2-day-old baby brother, "Tell me about God. I've almost forgotten." Tell me about God. I've almost forgotten. I find that to be a haunting and evocative story because it suggests that we come from God. And when we are very, very young, we still remember that. We still know that. But the process of growing up, of learning the language of this world, is a process of progressive forgetting. In a sense, even a process of progressive obliterating of that memory. Because as we learn the language of this world, the categories of this world get imprinted upon our psyches, and our sense of being a separate self grows stronger and stronger. That sense of disconnection continues throughout childhood until by the end of childhood, we may have lost that sense of connection altogether with the holy, the sacred, with God. But if we can get back in touch with who we are as God's children, if we can reconcile our relationship with God, we will be better at reconciling our relationships with others because we will not be basing our worth on the things of the world. We can let go of ego and insecurities, fears and anxieties. And we'll also be able to forgive others better. We'll realize that not forgiving someone is detrimental to ourselves. You know the old saying, not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and hoping someone else will die. But we all know we still miss the mark. There will be times that our jealousies and insecurities will get the best of us, won't they? Not only that, sometimes the situations are out of our control. Maybe it's the other person who won't come to the table, who won't forgive, who is not willing to reconcile. What do we do then? Our story today offers us good news. It reminds us that in time, things can get better. Relationships can be healed. It took many years, but in time, Joseph reunited with his brothers and father. Not only was Joseph's relationship restored with his family, his father's relationship, Jacob's relationship with his brother Esau, they also reconciled with each other after many years. So there's always hope. But there is more good news. Even when we mess up, even when things don't go well with our relationships, God can still use it and use us. God can take the mess in our lives and use it for God's purposes. As Joseph realized, God was able to save his family's life and the nation of Israel because he became powerful in Egypt. That wouldn't have happened had Joseph not been sold into slavery. Can you imagine someone leaning down over the edge of the pit while the brothers are busy bargaining with the slave traders and yelling to Joseph, "Don't worry, Joe. Everything will turn out just fine in the end." In this dance of life, it is not God's job to keep bad things from happening. They do happen. Brothers turn against brothers. People are bought and sold. Famine devastates the land. God's job is not to prevent these things from happening. God's job is to stay present in them and to keep on being God, creating whole worlds out of total chaos, breathing life into piles of dust, taking the wreckage of our lives and making something fine out of them in spite of us, because that's who God is. We are here today. This sanctuary is packed because a young man got very jealous and mistreated someone. Did you know that? Lives are being changed on the corner of Henry Street and Waters Avenue, partly because a man named John fell in love with a woman named Sophie. She got tired of waiting on him to take action and marry her, so she went up and married someone else. John got so mad, he refused to serve her communion. It happened right here in Savannah, less than 2 miles from where we are right now. The young woman's family brought him up on charges. He got on a boat and ran back to England with his tail between his legs. He was so depressed that he wrote in his diary that I came to the New World to save people, but who's going to save me? I'm lost. On the trip, he met some people called the Moravians. And while he was hanging out with them, he discovered that God loved him, not for what he did, not for what he said, not for what he had done, or not what he owned, not for what he accomplished, but for simply being a child of God. It changed his life, and he changed the world. So know that when things are not looking good for you and your situation, that God can take your stuff and use it to do great things. If you don't believe me, ask Joseph, ask John, or simply look around you this morning at all the people sitting in this sanctuary today. Amen and amen.